You're listening to Word on the Reef, diving into marine science on the Great Barrier Reef and beyond, with Tanya Murphy and Brett Goodban. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Word on the Reef. I'm your host, diver and marine conservationist, Tanya Murphy. And today my trusty co-pilot, Brett Goodban, is busy attending his son's high school graduation. So shout out to you, Senna. Congratulations, buddy. Anyway, Brett said he will try to pop in and join us later. So hopefully we will still get to enjoy his excellent company later on. Now, this week, folks, we have some pretty groundbreaking news. In a rescue mission never attempted before on the Great Barrier Reef, more than 3,000 sea turtle eggs have been evacuated from a low-lying sand island to save them from rising sea levels. For thousands of years, Raine Island, on the remote, far northern Great Barrier Reef, has been the world's largest green sea turtle nesting site. But due to climate change, it is no longer a safe or viable place for turtle eggs to hatch. Rising sea levels mean high tides flood the once dry island frequently, inundating the nests and drowning the turtle eggs, and driving the need for an emergency rescue mission. Here to tell us more about it is wildlife biologist and field management director at the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, Dr. Mark Reid. Good morning, Dr. Reid. Thanks for joining us on Word on the Reef.
Good morning, Tanya. Thank you for the opportunity.
Great to have you on the show. I'm super excited to learn about the turtle egg rescue mission. But first up, can you please tell us a bit about yourself and your background and where your passion for wildlife started?
No worries, thank you. My passion for wildlife started as a very, very young child because I grew up in Rockhampton and we had a lot of snakes and lizards around where I lived, and I just had a real interest in reptiles. I sort of nurtured that through high school and then was lucky enough to be able to go to university to study zoology primarily. And then I did some postgraduate work on marine turtles and then on crocodiles. That then led to me being able to be employed as a crocodile biologist by Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service for quite a few years. And a lot of my work was about how do we manage species that are potentially dangerous to people and minimise the risk to people who use our waterways and our communities. And that was a really nice springboard to allow me to come and work at the Reef Authority, where a lot of my work is about doing exactly those kinds of things. It's how do we support habitats that are critical for the species that call the Great Barrier Reef home, but also how do we ensure that the human use of those habitats is ecologically sustainable. So it's a really nice balance between strategy and operations.
I think your favourite animals, the reptiles, are some of the most interesting because they're so prehistoric. Turtles and crocodiles have been around since the times of the dinosaurs, and they're still here today for us to see, which is amazing. I think a lot of listeners would probably be fascinated to learn more about your adventures with crocodiles, which we might be able to get you back for a crocodile-focused show in the future. But I think also what everyone's excited to hear about is the turtle egg project. So let's dive into that. Let's talk about the plight of Raine Island and its turtle population. So for any listeners who aren't familiar, can you be our tour guide and take us in our imaginations to Raine Island? So how do we get there and what's it like?
Absolutely. So if we're departing from Cairns, everybody, we'd be travelling about 620 kilometres close to north to the remote northern Great Barrier Reef on the outer edge of the reef, where we'll find a tiny location called Raine Island. Raine Island is interesting because it's actually a detached reef, so it's out in the middle of the sort of deep water by itself. The island itself is about 30 hectares. The reef surrounding the island is about 210 hectares. So the island's about 830 odd metres long, about 440 metres wide at its widest point, with a circumference of about 1.8 kilometres. It's been used as a turtle rookery for at least a couple of thousand years that we know. and it does support the world's largest aggregation of nesting green turtles. So quite a few years ago when we had a really big season, it was estimated it was about 60,000 adult female turtles in the waters around Raine Island.
Wow.
It's probably one of the most important islands in the Great Barrier Reef for seabirds and seabird breeding. It has a really, really close cultural connection to the traditional owners, the Meriam Nation people of the Eastern Cluster and the Torres Straits, and the Wutjiti Aboriginal people of Cape York. So very, very deep connections there. And it also has a rich European history as well, because it has one of Queensland's oldest maritime structures on the island, which is a navigation tower built in 1844. So it's an extraordinary place. It's out in the middle of nowhere. It has a very, very high degree of protection under legislation, recognising that it's a biodiversity hotspot.
Yeah, I understand that nobody can set foot on it without permission. Obviously, research and traditional owners are some of the people that have permission to go on there. But in terms of anyone who's curious to visit this place, I think there's only very few tourism cruise expeditions that you can go on and moor up near Raine Island and snorkel and dive in those crystal clear waters, maybe see a whole lot of turtles, but I don't think tourists can set foot on it. So in our imaginations, we'll follow you there. So sea turtles have been laying their eggs at Raine Island for a long time, as you said. So that's why it must be hardwired into them to go back to the exact same spot every year. That's how turtles operate. When they reach sexual maturity, they go back to the same place where they were born to lay their eggs. So why are the eggs no longer safe at Raine Island after so many years of successful nesting on that island?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a pretty complicated one too. There's a couple of things in there. One is that, we're obviously seeing sea level rise around the world as the greenhouse gas emissions increase. And so that's certainly playing into the challenges at Raine Island, particularly when we get the big tides or we get sort of adverse weather conditions that can blow the waves onto the island itself. The second thing is that in many of the reefs around the world, there's a little animal called a foraminifera that produces a shell out of limestone. And on Raine Island, on the reef flat, there's a lot of these little foraminifera, and they contribute about 50% of the sand that's on Raine Island itself.
Can I just interject there?
Yes.
I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to practice saying the name of that thing. We love learning new things, so I'm going to give it a go. Foraminifera?
Foraminifera.
Foraminifera. Repeat this at home, folks. You've got a new scientific word.
Or forams is the sort of usual, the slang word for describing the little critters.
Foram. Is it, so that's a mollusk or?
No, it's not a mollusk. Actually, I have to say I'm not quite sure of what sort of, when we work up the familial chain where they sit, but they're
tiny and they have a shell which builds sand. That's what we need to know,
correct.
Right? Yeah.
That is correct, yes. But the other unique thing about that is that because the shells are made of limestone, as they're deposited on the beach and as the sand moves across the beach with normal processes and also with the turtles turning it over as they're building their nests, the little tests actually start to erode. They start to break down. And so what that means is that the sand at the front of the island, on the berm as we would call it, it's quite whole, it has fairly large granules in it. But as we move towards the back of the beach, those granules, particularly the little foram tests, start to break down and move towards smaller particles and dust so they can actually get blown away with the wind. So there's actually a bit of an erosion that happens across the beach as we move towards the back of the beach itself. So it's that combination of the increasing sea levels, the erosion of the sand and the movement of sand by the turtles that actually create this unique situation where eggs can be laid and then inundated by seawater.
Wow, yeah. So when we're talking about an island that is only 1.5 kilometres to walk around the perimeter, a strong extreme weather event could blow a lot of it away, I suppose. And I understand it's only 6 metres in elevation at the highest point. So even just a few centimetres of sea level rise that we're seeing means that the high tides can just drown all those turtle nests. So Yeah, I understand authorities have been trying for a while now using different methods to try and save the island, including carrying out some earthworks to try and increase the elevation of the nesting sites. Can you tell us a bit about those projects and how successful were they?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that's really, I think we're really fortunate for a lot of the islands and cays in the Great Barrier Reef that support animals like turtles and seabirds is that there's been a lot of people that have been monitoring those places for a long time. So they first started tagging turtles at Raine Island in the mid-70s. So we've got a really good history of the island from those tagging studies. And so when we discovered that there was an issue with the rising waters inundating the nests, we then started to think about, okay, what are the practical solutions that we can put in place to try and change this trajectory? And some of those, Raine Island is also, it's one of those places that's very remote, but it's one of the islands in the Great Barrier Reef that was mined for guano, for phosphate that they use for fertiliser and also for making things like gunpowder. So it was mined in the sort of late 1800s for guano phosphate. So that changed parts of the island. And so there's a high elevated sort of central portion of the island which supports most of the seabird nesting. Now, if the turtles can get up there onto that elevated top, there's a couple of issues with that. Number one is that they can wreak absolute havoc with all the seabirds nesting and the eggs and the chicks and those sorts of things. But also that means that if they then get to the edge of that high elevated central part of the island and fall over the cliff, if they land on their backs, they can't rewrite themselves.
Oh, no.
So, one of the practical solutions that we started quite a while ago is that we actually started to fence off the top part of the island just using really, really cheap aluminium pool fencing. And that actually stopped most of the turtles getting up on the top. So we saved the seabirds, but also we saved hundreds of turtles. And then at certain parts of the island, we built basically slippery ramps from polyester tubing, and so one-way ramps, so the turtles can't crawl up the ramps, but if they get up on the top and they get directed towards these ramps, they can go down.
Oh my goodness, turtles sliding down slides, that is adorable, but also very, very ingenious.
Yeah, and it's part of the work we do is to identify the sort of simple, practical measures we can put into place that make a difference for the species. So, we started off by doing the pool fencing and stopping animals from getting up on the top. We also started to rescue any turtles that were on the beach in the morning. Maybe just sort of delving into a little bit about the sort of biology of reptiles is that the body temperature of reptiles is determined primarily by the environment, particularly heat. So they don't have the same capacity to regulate their heat and their body temperature like we do as mammals. Mm. So if turtles are stuck on Raine Island in the morning, if by about 9:30, if they're still out on the beach, what that then means, unfortunately, is that they're taking on so much heat, both from the sun beating down on them, but also from crawling on really, really hot sand and that coming through their bodies, that it actually means that their body temperature goes over a lethal limit and eventually it will actually kill them.
Oh dear.
So one of the other things we do when we're on Raine Island working is that we do an early morning walk around the island, and if we find turtles that are still up in places where they're unlikely to make it back into the water by about 9:30, 10 o'clock, we actually manually, physically rescue these animals.
And so I understand they can weigh half a tonne or so.
They can certainly be, really big animals are in the sort of 150 to 180 kilo mark.
Okay, not half a tonne then, but pretty heavy still.
They're pretty heavy. They're also wild animals, so they get frightened, when you approach them. So they're generally speaking not particularly cooperative when you're trying to move them. And so we've got to then get these animals on sleds or power carriers and then take them down to the water and pop them back in the water. So we save as many turtles as we can. And that then they're the sort of fairly easy things to do. But then we thought about, okay, how can we deal with the nests being inundated? And that's when we actually started to do the beach reprofiling that you mentioned earlier. So we did a whole heap of work thinking about the risks of landing, major machinery on a remote island, things like biosecurity, potential hydraulic oil leaks, all those sorts of things. And then in 2014, we did our first big beach reprofiling exercise. We reprofiled about a 150-metre wide stretch of beach, and we raised the sand so the top of the sand meant that turtles can lay their eggs and they would be well above any of the tidal inundation levels that we'd measured previously. So we did that in 2014, 2017 and 2019. We've moved about 40,000 cubic metres of sand, equating to about 22% of the beach area on Raine Island being reprofiled.
So did you bring sand in from elsewhere or just moved it around a bit on the island?
Yeah, so we didn't bring any sand in, we moved it around. So effectively we grabbed sand from the beachfront, the berm, and then we moved it back over the beach itself to raise it up. But before we did any of that, we got some really, really smart scientists and had them calculate things like how much sand is actually produced on the beach or the reef flat at Raine Island. So how quickly would that area that we've just moved fill in with sand? And at that stage it was within about 3 months. So we moved all the sand back. We've done that 3 times. About 22% of the beach area is now above that tidal inundation level. And we found a couple of things. Number one, first of all, we'd created sort of more equal playing field for turtles to go and nest successfully. So we increased turtle nesting success. And certainly within the first sort of 12 months, we actually saw an increase in turtle hatchling production as well. So there was some immediate wins by doing the beach reprofiling.
That's an incredible effort.
Oh, it is, and it's a little bit surprising when you sort of go to somewhere remote like Raine Island and all of a sudden, there's an excavator sitting there that's moving sand around on the island.
It is remarkable because I understand David Attenborough wasn't even allowed to step foot on it when he was filming one of his famous documentaries, but now there's earth-moving equipment and pool fencing and water slides. Not water slides, just turtle slides. But yeah, it's a big project.
It's a massive project, and for us, it's about understanding the risk of the activities that we engage in. It's also about asking the question, if we do nothing, what's the end point of that decision as well? And for us, if we do nothing, it means that the population is going to be, increasingly threatened. So, being involved, making deliberate decisions to intervene was sort of all part of a longer-term strategy. One of the really important things to talk about here as well is that I mentioned earlier on how important Raine Island is for the local traditional owners, Meriam Nation people and the Wutjati people. When we do any of these works on the island, when we visit the island, we've always got traditional owners on board the boats, and as part of the work program, they're intimately involved in all aspects of the Raine Island Recovery Project. And when we're doing major projects like moving sand around, we actually have traditional owner representatives on the island as cultural heritage advisors. And it's great because you're working with them, they're talking about the cultural connection to the island, but it also means that if there's aspects of the work that we're proposing that might actually interfere with some of their cultural elements on the island, we can then just decide how we'll deal with that on the spot and change the way we're doing a particular activity. So there's a really lovely sort of immediate feedback, and it means that we can actually work really quickly and efficiently to get the jobs done. So it's a really unique project, Tanya, and it's been a real privilege to be involved in it.
So, Dr. Reid, investing all the time and energy to relocate thousands of eggs away from their natural nesting site can't have been an easy decision. It's sort of like getting to the point of abandoning a sinking ship, so to speak. It seems like a last resort. At what point did you reach the decision that this is now our best option?
Thanks, Tanya. A really, really good question. Part of the thinking that we do when we're managing species and the habitats that support those species is there's a concept that's called resilience-based management. So resilience-based management is effectively doing all of the actions that we can do that make a difference to try and buy time for the species and the habitats, so us as part of the global community can all make a difference reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and try and bring the climate trajectory under a more favourable, longer-term outcome. So with Raine Island, we've been working for many years thinking about what are the potential options we've got to effectively buy the time for Raine Island and for the green turtles to make a difference for future generations. And so we sort of weigh up all of the options. You know, we've talked about doing the pool fencing, we've talked about rescuing the adult females, we've talked about doing the breach reprofiling. And then, you know, one of the options that we've got to explore is, can we actually successfully move eggs from Raine Island to another nearby higher island and do that successfully, have a good outcome, and that then represents an additional management action that we can consider into the future to try and buy some time for Raine Island. So, as you mentioned, moving, you know, over 3,000 eggs from Raine to the nearby Sir Charles Hardy Island group wasn't a decision that we took lightly, and it was a decision that we worked through with all of the people involved in the Raine Island Recovery Project to make sure we had all the risks considered, all the people involved, and then all the sort of logistical elements you've got to do to try and move over 3,000 turtle eggs in a really, really remote location to another island. So that's the sort of thinking and the sort of risk approach that underpinned actually embarking on this particular adventure.
I understand last summer was the first time this egg relocation idea was put into action. So talk us through the process. How did you collect the eggs? How did you keep them safe? And where did you take them to?
Yeah, totally. So in terms of collecting the eggs, there's been a lot of research around the world about how do you actually transport turtle eggs and do it safely. Turtles and many other reptile species that lay eggs, the eggs themselves can be quite sensitive to being moved after a period of time. So if a turtle lays some eggs, if they stay in the nest for about 12 hours, moving them after that point will actually, if it's not done exceptionally carefully, can actually lead to the mortality of the little embryo that's actually starting to develop inside the egg. So one of the things that you can do is that if you can get the eggs effectively as they're being laid or very shortly thereafter, and then if you can cool them down, you can actually stop the development of the embryo. So effectively you can put the eggs into a condition what they call diapause, which is effectively pausing the development of the little embryo growing inside. So the team had to collect the eggs. They then had to put them inside bags, vacuum seal them down so they're nice and contained and kept together. Then they had to put them in refrigerators really quickly, bring their temperature down so they could actually move them safely. So, you know, thinking about the logistics of doing that in a remote location, it's pretty challenging, and the team did an extraordinary job doing that. They then, as part of that sort of lead-up work, we identified, working with the local traditional owners, where might be a good location that we could actually go and take the eggs and put them back in the sand and then monitor them through their development over that season. And the Wutiti people that we've been working with on Raine Island for so many years, one of the islands within their sea country is the Sir Charles Hardy Island group. They're a continental island group, so they have a higher topographical relief compared to places like Raine Island, so they're going to do better under a long-term sea level rise model. They've got beaches that are suitable for turtle nests and turtle eggs because there's already some turtles nesting there, so that's why we identified that site. So we translocated the eggs from Raine Island across to Sir Charles Hardy Island, put them back in the sand. The other thing we did is that we put little, what we call temperature loggers inside the nest themselves so we can monitor the temperature of the eggs over the period of their incubation. And why that's important, Tanya, and for the listeners, is that many reptiles are really interesting in the fact that the sex of the offspring isn't determined by a genetic contribution from mum and dad like we have as mammals. The sex of the offspring is generally determined by environmental parameters, and incubation temperatures particularly play a very, very strong role here. So with sea turtles, lower temperatures, lower incubation temperatures produce predominantly males. And then there's sort of a theoretical midpoint that you produce about 50-50 males, females, and then if you go over that midpoint, you produce a higher proportion of females. We've known from studies around the world and also within the Great Barrier Reef that the increasing temperature has already started to produce extra females. So we're really interested when we did the translocation to see whether or not the temperatures were going to produce, a high proportion of males or whether it's going to be really dominated by females.
Yeah, just for any listeners that aren't familiar, that issue of the feminisation of sea turtles has had some interesting research published on it already. Up to somewhere between 97 to 99% of sea turtle eggs hatching nowadays are coming out as female because climate change is obviously making the sands hotter. And we've got a lot of beautiful green sea turtles on the Great Barrier Reef at the moment, but most of them are female. So in the next generation, that's going to be a big problem. So that's why the rising temperatures are so threatening to the turtle reproduction. And so there's some measures which we can sort of help with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first time, which you mentioned, Tanya, last year when we moved the first lot of eggs, we just put them in the sand, put the temperature loggers in, and then, we went away and then we came back a couple of months later. We dug the nests out to see how successful they were, and we got about greater than 70% of the nests producing hatchlings, which was great.
Amazing.
The temperature loggers indicated, however, that pretty much all of the nests would have produced female hatchlings because they're all above that pivotal temperature, that midpoint temperature that's going to produce the mix of males and females. So that was the first year's attempt to do that egg translocation, so making sure that we could...
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say how exciting it must have been to go back and look in the nests and see that they've all hatched. It must have been an incredible moment.
Yeah, it really is, and we get, we're really privileged to be able to work on such a project like this one because we get so many of those moments where you can, those pinch me moments when you do something extraordinary and you go, wow. We've actually been part of doing that. So.
Because the chance of those eggs hatching and surviving on Raine Island would have been extremely low. Like the hatching rate on Raine Island has been extremely low for years now, hasn't it? So the difference that you've made to allow 70% of them to hatch is tangible difference, isn't it?
It certainly is, but also demonstrating that you can do something like that in such a remote location is actually a really critical thing to celebrate as well. So based on what we learnt from last year, the team said, righto, we're going to do this again, but this time we're actually going to build a shade cloth structure on Sir Charles Hardy Island with the permission of the traditional owners. And when we translocated the eggs, this season, we've already translocated 50 clutches. That's probably over somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 eggs.
Wow.
So those eggs have been collected from Raine. They've been moved across to Sir Charles Hardy Island, and once again, they've been put back in the sand, but underneath the shade cloth structure. And of course, we've put temperature loggers in there as well. And we've got temperature loggers outside of the shade structure as our controls just to see how we go. So,
yeah, it looks like a greenhouse, but instead of keeping the eggs warmer, it's hopefully going to shade them and keep them cooler. This looks like something that you see over the blueberries and the tablelands, keeping the blueberries shaded or, fruit and veg shade cloths.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a little bit weird to think about having to build things like that on a remote island. But once again, these are the sorts of measures that we've got to do to try and give the turtles the best chance. So from our perspective, what we're hoping is that the shade cloth will make a difference, that it'll actually cool the nests down to the stage where we're likely to see a higher proportion of male hatchlings come out. And that's ultimately what we're aiming for. We're aiming to try and redress that balance and produce more males.
Yeah, I've never held a turtle egg and, don't try this at home, everyone. But are they hard shells or sort of leathery?
They're leathery shells, Tanya, so they're about the size of ping pong balls, and they're a leathery shelled egg versus a hard shelled egg. So you can actually, you can squeeze them gently and they'll dimple. And that's actually one of the survival mechanisms for the turtles because they drop the eggs from a reasonable height into the hole that they've dug. And if the eggs are leathery, then they actually bounce when they hit the bottom of the nest chamber as well. So it's a mechanism to stop them from being impacted by the nesting process.
Welcome back to Word on the Reef. If you've just joined us, our guest today is Dr. Mark Reid, wildlife biologist and field management strategy director at the Marine Park Authority. But we've also had my trusty co-host, Brett Goodman, enter the chat.
I'm here finally.
He had another commitment this morning, so raced over here to join us. So good to have you here, Brett.
Yes, hello everybody.
Okay, so Dr. Mark Reid, we've been talking about this fascinating project to evacuate sea turtle eggs from Raine Island to save them from rising sea levels and the erosion of that island away, and relocate them to another island, which I understand, Charles Hardy Island. I looked it up on Google Maps and measured it, and I think it's about 100 kilometres away from Raine Island, but in the scale of the Great Barrier Reef, it's one of the closer islands, and it is a continental island, which means it has a bit more rocky, mountainous profile, which will protect it from those rising sea levels. And so they've relocated 3,000 eggs last year and about between 4,000 and 5,000 eggs this laying season. Last year's had a high success rate of hatchlings. This year they've added some shade cloths to protect those eggs from the extreme heat waves that we're seeing more of due to climate change. And that's hoped that that will also increase the survival chance of these turtles. But Dr. Reid, what will happen to those baby sea turtles after they hatch? You said that last year's clutch, you checked the nests, the eggs were broken, so you knew that they had hatched. It would have been great if there was a live camera so you could have seen them make their way
webcam
to the ocean. But where will they go? And when they reach adulthood, do you think they will find their way back to nest on Charles Hardy Island, where you've placed them? Or is there a chance they are hardwired to go back to Raine Island, since their ancestors have been going to Raine Island for thousands of years?
Yeah, great question, Tanya. Thank you. And good morning, Brett. Thanks for joining in. That's great.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us. This is fantastic. Great talk too.
Oh, absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure. So turtle hatchlings turtles themselves are actually very, very cool, but turtle hatchlings are extraordinary because as they're developing in the egg, they're actually already starting to orientate themselves within the Earth's sort of geomagnetic field. And that really comes to play as they hatch out of the egg and as they're running across the beach. There's some really, really small pieces of material, like minute pieces of material in their brains, which allows them to sort of almost geolocate themselves within the Earth's geomagnetic field to provide a point of reference that allows them to return back to that area when they're sexually mature. So, tiny little turtle hatchling, 50-odd centimetres long, they run across the beach like a little wind-up toy, and they're not only picking up the cues within their brain about where to come in the future, but they're also doing things like they're orientating themselves to things like the current that they'll hit when they hit the water, those sorts of cues. So they're picking up multiple cues from the environment that will allow them, in the future, to navigate back to that area.
It's absolutely miraculous that they have that power.
Every time I tell people that in the turtle tour at the aquarium, they're like, sorry, they have Google Maps. They have their own little GPS system, but then that's good and bad, isn't it, Doc? So, if you have issues at Raine Island, they're going to keep coming home.
Totally. Yeah. So, and what we know is that they'll basically, those that survive run across the beach, running the gauntlet through the water. They'll then go out into the major currents and they'll get pulled and moved around to those sort of major oceanic currents. We know for sort of 5, 7, 8 years, they'll then come back and they'll then take up residence on a feeding ground somewhere. Now, this is where it also gets pretty interesting because that feeding ground for this particular group of turtles can be as far south as Moreton Bay, for example. It can be as far east as, out in the Solomons. It can go all the way up into, Papua New Guinea, and can extend as far west as Arnhem Land and West Papua. So that's the broad-scale distribution that they might end up on in the feeding grounds. Now, they'll go into that feeding ground. Green turtles are primarily herbivorous, so they're feeding on seagrasses and algae. They'll stay there for somewhere approaching between 30 and 50 years before they reach sexual maturity. Then when they get to that point, they'll make a decision to undergo that breeding migration back to that natal area. So they might not necessarily come back to Sir Charles Hardy Island or even Raine Island, but they might come back to one of the islands within, probably tens of kilometres from where they've hatched. So it's an extraordinary part of their life history, but it's also an extraordinary journey that they can do that, 30 to 50 years after they've hatched.
Oh, it's amazing. Yeah, every time I explain that to my customers, I still can't believe it. I mean, I can't even tell you which street's Martin Street in Cairns, and I've lived here nearly my whole life. Turtles can navigate home after that long.
Yeah. People look at the dopey look on the turtle's face and think that they're stupid, but, I mean,
no,
they've got all of the cleverness that they need to do things that we can't do. But, of course, this egg relocation project is a wonderful emergency response to help this particular turtle population, but it doesn't fix that overall problem of rising sea levels coming to our low-lying islands. What's going to happen to Raine Island? Are we just leaving it to disappear beneath the waves? It's also a globally significant seabird nesting site. Are we going to rescue the bird eggs as well?
Yeah, look, mate, really, really good questions, and these are the sort of dilemmas that we wrestle with regularly as protected area managers, like how much do we intervene, how often do we intervene, what's the longer-term trajectory? So for somewhere like Raine Island, the work we're doing right now it's really about buying time to try and provide that longer-term future for the population, for future generations. So we'll do everything we can to try and keep Raine Island as functional as possible as a turtle rookery. So, making sure that the beach tree profiling still keeps the eggs above that tidal inundation level to give them the best chance to produce hatchlings. Parallel to that, we'll keep on trialling this egg translocation project. Now, if we can do that successfully and we can demonstrate that we can provide some cooling to produce some more male hatchlings, we'll then come back to that and go, righto, we were able to do that, we were able to demonstrate that we could do that successfully. How do we then apply that more broadly across the northern Great Barrier Reef where this particular group of turtles nests?
Well, as they say, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket.
Oh, look at you.
Absolutely, yep, that's right.
Excellent joke.
Yes.
He cracked me up.
So, and look, that might mean that different traditional owner groups decide that they're going to do egg translocation in their local area to try and improve the outcome. It certainly might mean that we as government protected area managers might decide that we'll continue to do egg translocation from Raine Island to other islands to improve that. It's almost like, you think about working your finances and having a diversified portfolio of stocks so you make sure that your risk is spread across a whole range of places. We're doing pretty much the same sort of thing. We're looking at spreading the risk so we don't have, to use Tanya's pun, all the eggs in one basket. We're actually moving eggs to different locations, giving Raine Island the best chance for that longer-term future, buying ourselves time so we can, as a global community, hopefully we'll get to the stage where we can bring our greenhouse gas emissions down and try and change that longer-term climate trajectory.
Yes, as a global society, we've left it down to the wire, where we've gotten to the point where we have to evacuate sea turtle eggs. Scientists have been shouting about climate change for decades, and it's just been
and this is the reality
delay,
of
political
it,
delay,
isn't it? It's happening.
Yeah, it's well beyond time for cutting carbon emissions. So, speaking of rising sea levels claiming wildlife, I want to briefly give a mention of the bramble K melamus, which was a plump, cute little rodent. And when people come to Australia, one of the most famous things that people want to see is the quokka, which famously only lives on one island off the coast of Western Australia. Absolutely adorable. But a lot of people don't know that the Great Barrier Reef used to have its own cute little furry rodent that lived only on one small island near the northern end of the Great Barrier Reef. It was called the bramble K melamus, and it went extinct in 2019. It was announced extinct due to the rising sea levels washing away its tiny little island. And researchers went to check on it about a couple of decades ago. They only found about a dozen. They went back a few years later and found even less. And then by 2019, they did another survey and found none, and actually announced it as the first mammal to go extinct directly because of climate change. The reason I'm summing that up so quickly is because we don't have much time left. But I know you're a reptile expert, Mark, but did you have anything to do with that bramble K monitoring?
I did actually, Tanya, yes. So in my previous life when I was working in Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service, one of the teams I managed was the threatened species team that were actually focusing on the Bramble Cay melomys. And in many ways, that's the real siren call for us, I think, as a global community, is that we're seeing some of these examples of these treasured little species going extinct because of things like rising sea level. Bramble Cay, or Marzope Kawa, as it's called in the local dialect, is another low-lying cay. It's really similar in terms of how it's built and maintained as Raine Island. Low-lying, it's got the little forams that make up the sand, and it's, unfortunately, as sea level has risen, the cay is increasingly overtopped by waves. So the vegetation that the melomys used to rely upon has been gradually being reduced, and so the habitat that supported that little animal is no longer as it used to be. So that, to me, is a real siren call.
The evidence is right there, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like, how many species do we need to lose before everyone over at the COP puts their foot down and makes the right decisions? I hope they are. Now, this is a topic for a whole separate episode with maybe some traditional owners, but then there's the Torres Strait Islands that have been home for thousands of years to the Torres Strait Islander people. Are also, many of those islands are having seawaters washing all the way over the top of their island and down the other side again. So how do you grow food in those conditions, and how do you have fresh drinking water and spring water in those conditions? So that is a topic for a whole separate episode, but we can sort of tie it all in together to the plight of these sea turtles. And I think while this egg evacuation project inspires a lot of hope, I hope it doesn't cause anyone out there to become complacent and think, well, the turtles have been rescued, Dr. Reid's got it all under control, so we'll leave it up to him. We don't need to worry about our actions, because at this desperate stage where we need to put wild animals in artificial habitats to save them from extinction in the wild, it feels a little bit apocalyptic. And that reminds me of another project called the Forever Reef Project, where they are taking corals out of the Great Barrier Reef and putting them into aquariums to literally save each species from going extinct from coral bleaching. And we'll talk about that incredible project in more detail on a future show.
Absolutely.
But I'd just like to leave everyone with those somber thoughts, to try and just get everyone to aim higher and dream of a future where our kids and grandkids can see these animals naturally reproducing in the wild, not just in an artificial environment or, you know, God forbid, in a virtual reality headset being the only way that our kids can see these creatures in their natural habitat. So
we don't want that.
We've only got 2 minutes left, Dr. Reid, so no time for more questions, but is there anything else you wanted to finish off on?
I think the thing I wanted to finish off on, Tanya and Brett, is that, you know, you can't do any of these projects by yourself.
No.
One of the reasons why the Raine Island Recovery Project has been so successful is that there's been a team-based approach. So there's been government. We've obviously been working in partnership with the traditional owners, which is incredibly critical. We were lucky enough that we actually had some funding support with the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, working with BHP to get us some funding to be able to do some of these works. And we've also had 2 rounds of funding from the Commonwealth Government as well that enable us to deliver these sorts of conservation projects. So, you know, I really want to finish on the fact that, you know, there has been a genuine team-based approach to deliver the Raine Island Recovery Project. And Tanya, I really just wanted to lean into the fact that we can all make a difference in terms of how we choose to live our lives. The small things make a difference. You know, making sure that we've got energy-efficient equipment in our houses, moving towards renewables, making deliberate choices to change our cars, for example, to EVs or hybrids, and even doing something, you know, really, really simple, like actually choosing not to drive your car and either taking public transport or walking or cycling. All of those things are helping us to reduce our carbon footprint, which in the long term are the things that are going to make a difference in and amongst all the other big changes that we have to make as a global community.
Yep. Fantastic advice.
Absolutely perfect way to finish off the episode. Sadly, that's all we have time for today. So Dr. Mark Reid, wildlife biologist and field management director at the Marine Park Authority, thanks for all your amazing work, and thanks for joining us on Word on the Reef today.
Oh, it was an absolute privilege. Thanks, guys.
Hopefully I get to talk to you for a bit longer next time.
Yeah,
Thanks for your work.
We'll talk crocodiles next time. Have a great day.